Hello and welcome to E233. I'm your instructor, Gregory Myers. In this video, we're going to take another look at our student course registration system demo. Specifically, we're going to focus in on the ability to add a student to our system. This video assumes that you've watched the earlier videos focusing on how to set up your student course registration system, as well as how to work with our static array. This video also assumes that you have worked through some of the functions in the static array, and it would probably be a good idea to go ahead and open the .h files corresponding to the project, as well as open a copy of our students.csv. So let's go ahead and get started, and we'll jump right into the function and try to understand exactly what we want to have happen here. You'll see our add student accepts 3 input arguments, the array of students that we have somehow retrieved from our students.csv file. We'll test that later on in the video. It also gets a count, which is passed then by address that simply keep track of the valid number of students in our array, and then a new student that we are attempting to add to the array. Now, keep in mind, if you go back to the student type, that we have a field called student ID, and the idea is that we would keep that student ID unique among all of the students. So basically what we need to do is think about what behavior we want to have happen when we first don't find a student. In other words, then we want to add them, but then what do we do if we do find the student with a matching ID? Well, at this point, then, what we want to do is we simply want to change their status from either unknown or inactive to active. So you can sort of think of this as a scenario in which you may have taken a couple of semesters off. You wouldn't get a new account. You would simply reactivate your existing account. So let's go ahead and get started here. We'll start by adding some temporary variables. In this case, we're going to be interested in our index as a way of looping through each one of the students in the students array. We'll probably also benefit from having a found integer that will basically act as a flag that we can determine then whether or not we did find a matching student ID. And at this point, we simply want to initialize these. So our index will be equal to 0, and our found will be equal to 0, which in this case is going to act like false, and then we can simply set up a while loop that allows for us to loop through our existing students array one by one, and the conditions for the while loop will basically be while our index is in fact less than our count and found is equal to 0. There's no use in continuing to look if we have in fact already found the match. At this point, then, what we want to do is we want to use our own string compare function, which will accept 2 strings. One will be the current student that we are looking at. So in other words, students, square brackets, and then the index of that student. And we will be looking at their student ID. And if their student ID matches the student ID of the student that we are trying to add to the system, and we're going to assume that case does not matter. So in this case, we use case insensitive. If our string compare returns 0, that means there's 0 differences between those 2 strings, and hence we have found a match. Under the else branch, we simply want to keep looking. And under the true branch here, if we have found a match, we want to go ahead and do a couple of things. The first thing, before we forget, is going to be to set our found equal to 1, or basically something else other than 0. In this case, then this will mean that we have found a match, or it's true. And then, as I mentioned earlier in the video, we then want to simply make sure that that particular student is now active in our system. So In this case, then what we'll do is we'll say students, square brackets, index, and for the student status, we simply want to leverage our active status enum. Under the else branch, we want to keep looking, which basically just simply means that we want to increment our index. And now, once we have managed to make it the whole way through our students, if we have still not found a match, we want to add the student. But in order to be able to determine if that's the case, we need to check the value of that found variable. And so if our found is still equal to false, basically we have a problem here, or maybe not a problem, but rather we want to add that student to our array. We want to also make sure that we do not already have too many students in our array. Since this video and this library does not focus on dynamic memory allocation, we are limited to the number of students that we can handle, and that is simply handled in a constant student count max. And so what we want to do now is we want to make sure that we still have enough room, and to do that we simply check to see the value of count, and we want to make sure that it is in fact still less than student count max. And as long as those two conditions are true, we can simply add them to our array. And in this case, it's going to be students, square brackets. And at this point, then what you can do is you can actually utilize either your index or your count variable, since they will be the same value at this point. And we'll say students, square brackets, index dot student status is going to be equal to the individual student dot student status. And what we could do is we could simply do a field by field copy. But if you recall from an earlier video, we already have the ability to do that. And that comes in our copy student function. So rather than rewrite that, we're going to leave the copy student function to do the work for us, in which case we can simply say copy student. And for the destination, what we will provide is the address of the student's square brackets index. In other words, that location in the array where we want to put the information about the new student. And for the source, we simply use the student. Now, there's a couple of things that we do want to consider here before we move on, is that we are doing no real validation of the student. In other words, the student that could be passed, for instance, may have a student ID of length 0. They may, for instance, not have a first name or middle initial or a last name. And the middle initial is fine, but we would probably agree that there are certain fields that we do want to validate. So inside of your add student, especially after you have determined that you don't have a matching Blazor ID, you should consider, rather matching student ID, you should consider doing some additional validation on the student. And this can be done a couple of different ways. You can go ahead and create a helper function that will simply do all of your validation for you, in which case then it might look like something like int as a return value, validate underscore student, and it simply does some of your repetitive checks for you. But at the very least, you would want to make sure that your student that you are adding does in fact have a student ID that is valid. So up here, what we probably want to do, even before we start looping through the contents of our students array, we can simply have a quick check on the student itself. And so in this case, if the string length of the student dot student ID is equal to 0, then we can simply say printf error no valid student ID, and we'll go a step further to say no valid student dot student ID was provided. At this point, we would probably agree that our results are going to be equal to exit failure. And then under the else branch is then where we want to attempt to add that student to our array. And so you can hopefully sort of get an understanding of how you would go about validating the additional parameters or additional fields in your student that were in fact critical. Okay, and you could just do a series of string lengths, if statements with string lengths, to be able to determine whether or not you had enough information about the student to attempt to add them. So let's first of all compile this. And then let's see if we've got any typos here. So it appears as if we have an issue here with our copy student. If you recall from our earlier video, we discussed that the copy student accepts the address of the destination as well as the address of the source. So in this case, it's very simple modification that we need to make. We simply pass it the address of the student instead of the student structure itself. And we also have one other thing that we want to do once we have been successful at adding the student, and that is we want to increment our count. So we just simply do that by adding 1 to the existing count. Let's go ahead and build it one more time and see if we have any other mistakes. No, that looks good. And so now what we want to do is we want to go back to our student course registration system driver, and we want to go through the steps of adding a student to our system. And if you recall, we've already got a lot of this set up in our main, and what we'll do is we'll focus on that particular switch under the branch of students that will allow for us then to add a particular student. Now, if you recall from our earlier videos that we've already set this up in that we have the correct number of arguments, or the argc is equal to 7. And specifically, argv square brackets 1 is /student and argv square brackets 2 is /add. Beyond that, we've done no additional error checking. And so we would probably want to do some things inside of our add student. At this point, we're just going to assume then that our argv square brackets 3 through our argv square brackets 6 do in fact hold valid information. And you can do this one of two ways as far as utilizing these arguments. You can create some additional variables that you can add up here to the top. One is going to be a character of the student ID, and it's going to be an array, in which case you want to make sure that it is the same size or at least large enough to hold the longest student ID that you might need. And so for some guidance, then you could probably look at your student course registration system.h to see what the lengths of the fields are. In this case, for our ID, we left it at 10. We can do the same thing for our student first name. which case we've made that 20. The student middle initial is going to be equal to 2, and the student last name is once again going to be equal to 20. Now, you need to be careful here, rather the length of the student last name will be equal to 20. You want to be careful here to make sure not to exceed these lengths. And remember that you're going to need an additional character then for the end of string character. And so what you want to do here is you would want to do some preliminary validation on your arguments. We're going to not focus on that in this particular video. Instead, we're going to focus on getting our function for adding student working correctly. And so the very first thing that we want to do then is go ahead and use our string copy to copy each one of the arguments into a little more friendly variable. What I mean by that is we would have our student ID, and if you recall from our argument list, that should be your argv square brackets 3. We also can do a string copy for the student first name, and that should be coming from our argv square brackets 4. We can do a string copy of our student last name, and that should then come from our argv square brackets 6. Now, I haven't intentionally skipped over our argv square brackets 5 because the student or the user of our system should only be providing a initial and not an entire name. So you've got a couple of ways that you can go about doing this. So you can check the length of argv square brackets 5 and tell the user that you have provided too long of an argument for argv square brackets 5, or you can simply handle this by taking whatever value they pass to you and simply taking the 0th element of argv square brackets 5. What I mean by that is we can do something along the lines of this right here. We can say our student middle initial square brackets 0 is going to simply be equal to argv square brackets 5, and then for the second index we would use the 0th element. Essentially that is the first character in argv square brackets 5, and then what you would do then for the second character in the middle initial is you would just simply make sure that you did in fact have an end of string character. And that guarantees or essentially truncates, you would want to make sure that goes in the first position there, the index equal to 1 position. That would guarantee then that you would not get too long of a middle initial. At this point then what we want to do is we want to import the existing students, and we've demonstrated how to do that in an earlier video, as well as setting up our students array. And so we would simply say import students. We would specify the file name, which is going to be our students.csv. And we would specify then the array students and the address of our count variable. The next step would be to attempt to add the student, in which case we would need a temporary student. So we'll come up here and we will create now a new variable of type student type. And we will just simply call this one student temp. And we will use these arguments to populate then our student temp. So we'll start off by saying student temp dot student status, and we'll go ahead and set it to a default of active. We can, or we would love to be able to do this right here, field by field, in which case we would do our student ID. But remember that we can't copy strings this way. Instead, what we want to do is use our string copy function to copy to the destination the source. And once again, you'll notice here that I could have probably simply used my RV square brackets 3, but it would have been a little bit harder or a little more confusing for us to do any additional validation. And remember that we're skipping over the validation here, but you really would want to check to see that each one of your arguments had a reasonable value in it. So for instance, that your student ID, the length was in fact greater than 0. We can continue now with the additional fields. So we'll do the student temp first name. And we can do this with the middle initial and the last name as well. And at this point then, we have a fully constructed and initialized temp student, which we can then pass to our add student. And remember that we pass to our add student the entire students array, the address of the count should it need to be updated, and the temp student or student temp that we have just created. And this would probably not be a bad idea to go ahead and capture the return value or the results values from some of these functions and display them much like we have done earlier. So what you could do is you could say results equal to your import student, and then a printf where you simply demonstrate the results with a %d followed by a new line. And then everywhere you make a call to a function, you simply capture then the return value. In this case, most of ours are going to be integers, and you display it. And then, of course, the last step in this process is going to be to export our newly updated array. So in this case, we want to export our array. And once again, we'll say results are equal to export students, we can specify the file name as students underscore new.csv. And we'll pass the entire students array once again, as well as the count, but this time not using the address of the count variable, just the value of the count variable. And once again, we can simply print the results. Let's go ahead and build it one more time. And let's go ahead and go to our folder with our executable as well as our files. And you'll notice that from an earlier demonstration, we already have a students underscore new.csv. Let's go ahead and delete that just to make sure that we are in fact creating our output file. We can come over to the console. We can attempt to run our switches. First, we'll put in just student and add, and you'll see that we do not have enough arguments. We're actually being prompted with the help, in which case you can come down here and you can see, and we need to provide all of this information right here. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add a new student here. I'm going to come up with a ID here. How about if we do S Burns, and the first name is going to be Sally, and middle initial is going to be M, and then Burns will be the last name. And so you'll see now that I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 total arguments. And so unless we have a mistake here, this should in fact now add a student. And if we come over to our folder and take a look now, we should have an active student, ID S Burns, first name Sally, and so on. Now let's attempt to add the same user one more time, but without doing anything different. We still get the results equal to 0, but we should not have a second entry for that particular user. And also, if we make any modification to anything other than the ID, the student ID, it should not result in a new student. So let's say, for instance, that we got their middle initial wrong. It was supposed to be an N. Once again, we'll see here now that we have made the changes to the user, but we have not in fact added a new user. Why not? Well, it's because we have been continually pulling from the same file. We pulled from the students.csv, and we are writing to the students underscore new.csv. What we would like to do rather than that is we'd like to use the same input file as the output file. And so if we come down here, this makes for a great test to use a new file. What we'd really like to be able to do is to export our array to the same file that we are using to import from. This allows for our system then to continually be updated. Once again, you want to test with a temporary file, or you want to make a backup copy of your students.csv, because otherwise you can accidentally overwrite or damage your students file in testing. So let's go ahead and compile this one more time. Let's come out here to the console. This time around, what we're going to do is we're going to go back to the Sally M. Burns. All of the results look good. We're going to close our students new because effectively we're not using that anymore. But also what we want to do is note here on the timestamp that we have in fact made a change to our students.csv. Notice here that I just recently compiled, and there is my executable, and my students.csv have similar timestamps. But more importantly, if I come here and I drag this students.csv into NetBeans, you'll see there is our user, our new student. And now when I rerun this and make an attempt to change a piece of information about our user from M to N, it's still successful, but there is in fact no change because we currently treat the S Burns as a unique user. So in other words, once our algorithm found S Burns, it doesn't do anything else. So how would you get around this? Well, I would consider adding another function here called update student that allows for you to update only existing students. So for instance, if there was a typo in one of their fields, one of their non-critical fields, such as the student ID. In other words, we wouldn't want to make a change to the student ID, but we could make changes to the other fields. At this point then, what we want to do is we also want to see what happens when we attempt to enter a user that is already in our system. And in this particular case, we're going to focus on our G. Myers user. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to rerun our student add, and I'm going to pass it in this case, my user ID, my first name. I'm going to have empty quotes for argv5 and my last name. At this point, once again, we have all zeros for our results. In other words, no issues. But also, you'll notice that in my students.csv file, I am no longer unknown. I am, in fact, active in the system because it found my ID. And once it found my ID, it simply changed my status from unknown to active. So hopefully you found this video and this demonstration useful. Keep in mind now that we are not only using our own import function as well as our own file read line, string compare, and string length, but we are now also using our own add student. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to email me, and thank you for watching.